We are in the midst of a cultural revolution. A cultural revolution that is manipulating and programming our very own children to view the world, and more specifically the United States and the Western world, in a particular way. A particularly Marxist way that sees our country and values as oppressive and evil, and therefore needing to be torn down. One of the ways by which this is happening is by using our own children as a means to separate one generation from another, by teaching them to not only reject the culture their parents grew up in, but to actively overthrow it for a culture completely antithetical to it. They are turning our children into a woke guard that will facilitate the erasure of American Western values, to be replaced by woke Marxist values. And it's all being done in plain view for everyone to see, in our very schools, by woke activist teachers that are themselves trained in colleges to perpetuate these beliefs and instill them in the children under their care. Whether those beliefs are from critical race theory with concepts like whiteness, privilege, and systematic racism, or from queer theory with concepts like sexual orientation, gender identity, and pronouns. All of this woke Marxist ideology is being used to program children to become woke activists themselves.
I teach my elementary school students about gender identity. Learning about gender identity helps children develop critical social-emotional skills such as self-awareness, social awareness, and respect. I teach my students that there's a whole spectrum of gender identities and that everyone, whatever their gender, deserves love and respect. Some people are girls, some are boys, some are both, some are neither. Gender is all about how we feel on the inside and how we express ourselves. The most important thing I teach my students is that it's our job to listen to and learn from people when they share with us who they are, and that we need to use the name and the pronouns that people ask us to use when we refer to them. Here are some of the books and tools that I found the most useful when teaching about gender identity.
This is precisely what these woke activists disguised as teachers are doing by teaching children this ideological nonsense. While some are doing it because the ideology has become so ingrained in them that they can't help but espouse it to anyone who will listen, that being a major tenet of the belief in the first place, to perpetuate it and to use it to change the world around them, there are still many teachers that know they're doing this and are doing it deliberately. I mean, how explicit do you need to get with a teacher in California saying, "I have 180 days to turn them into revolutionaries"? They're not shy about this when you get them behind closed doors. You have school officials in elementary schools saying their mission is to empower everyone to become change agents, which is just another Marxist term for revolutionary. Because they want these kids to go out into the world and to use this ideological snake oil to change the world around them through activism. I mean, what other explanation can you give for having little kids do something like this? Why else do schools now have a week of action talking about Black Lives Matter, framing it as a national coalition organizing for racial justice in education? Because it's all aimed at getting these concepts into schools in order to teach it to children. As these activists aren't concerned about teaching kids things like reading or math. You don't need to read or write things to be good little revolutionaries. As the head of the Los Angeles Teachers Union put it, it's okay that kids don't know math. Because as she puts it, it's okay that our babies may not have learned all their timetables. They learned resilience. They learned survival. They learned critical thinking skills. They know the difference between a riot and a protest. They know the words insurrection and coup. If that's the mindset the head of the teachers union has towards what kids are learning, what does that sound like she's preparing them for? Certainly not the means to prepare them for the workforce or to understand how the economic society works or to just generally be educated. No. It sounds exactly what you would teach someone if you're preparing them for some kind of revolution. And that's exactly what they're preparing them for. From elementary school all the way up to college. So by the time they're young adults and able to go out and affect the world on their own, they've become 100% woke Marxist activists who are now imbued with a racial consciousness that views society through the lens of critical race theory and queer theory. So that when they're confronted with elements of the political right, or in general just anyone that disagrees with them, they'll shout them down as racist, sexist, or just plain fascist. So this is the goal, to turn our kids into a woke guard for a cultural revolution. So how exactly are they achieving it? Sure, we know they're teaching critical race theory and queer theory in schools, and by teaching what we really mean is they're doing these things in school. They're putting the theories into practice. But by what means are they really doing it? Well, the model by which they're doing it is very, very similar, some might even say a carbon copy, of what Mao Zedong did in China during the 1960s with his Red Guard, who inflicted these same types of Marxist ideas into Chinese schools, targeting what he called the four olds: old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas, all of which he wanted to get rid of, which reflects what we're experiencing today with woke activists talking about how oppressive and outdated American society is with things like capitalism, Christianity, statues, gun culture, you name it. It's all looked at as things that need to be torn down and replaced, just as Mao did. So, what did Mao do? He separated Chinese kids into two groups with certain identities. First, the black identities that were the bad ones. Things like landlord, rich farmer, counter-revolutionary, bad influencer, and even right-winger, which they called rightist. These were the identities that anyone that didn't agree with them were labeled as. Therefore, you were targeted with humiliation, ridicule, harassment, bodily harm, and in some cases, even death. I mean, does that not sound very similar to what we're going through today? I mean, thankfully we haven't arrived at the death part yet, but the rest is spot on. So, of course, kids didn't want to experience that. So, what were they to do if they were labeled as, say, landlord because their parents were landlords or rich farmers? Well, they were given a way out with what was called a red identity. Things like peasant, or worker, or even just revolutionary. They could take on that identity and become one of the Red Guard. And what did the Red Guard do? Well, they were activists, and they did what activists do. They protested. They rioted. They attacked anyone that disagreed with them, and of course, they destroyed. And what they destroyed is exactly what Mao told them to. Old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. Which meant destroying things like religious documents, religious statues, temples, anything that represented the old things that were seen as oppressive. This is precisely what we're seeing today. And so, how are they replicating Mao's Red Guard in our schools? Well, instead of bad identities like farmer, counter-revolutionary, and so on, they've been replaced with more personal identity factors like white, male, cisgender, able-bodied, etc. These are the black identities. The identities that are scapegoated as the bad oppressors that are upholding the white supremacist patriarchal system that is oppressing all the minorities. And ideas like these are being taught to children by means of things like critical race theory, even in elementary school.
If you're white, yes, you are racist. Even if you think you're woke, we all benefit from oppression. Pretending you're not racist only makes racism grow.
If you don't believe that there's white privilege, please don't teach. If you don't believe that Black Lives Matter, please don't teach. If you don't believe in systemic racism and how it negatively impacts our students of color and don't want to help dismantle those systems, please don't teach.
My children are now in private school and are thriving. We had specifically moved chased out of LCPS due to the swift and uncompromising political agenda of Superintendents Williams, Ziegler, and the school board that have forced upon us. First, it was in early spring of 2020 when my 6-year-old somberly came to me and asked me if she was born evil because she was a white person, something she learned in a history lesson at school.
So, of course, kids don't want to be called evil for simply being white, or an oppressor for being a male or cisgender. It's psychologically damaging and basically child abuse to break down a kid's identity like this. Whether it's telling them white people are bad when they themselves are white, or simply telling them boys and girls aren't real, that they're just social constructs. You can choose which one you want to be. Exactly like this.
Do you want a super easy and trick question to exploring gender identity with your kids? Try this. Do you sometimes feel more like a girl or more like a boy, or maybe them both or neither?
So, just like the children in China were given a means to get away from their black identities, children in America are being given the same means to get out of their black identities through things like queer theory, or just wokeism in general. You want to stop being an evil white person? You can become an ally. Want to no longer be an oppressive cisgender? You can become non-binary, or even become a transgender. You can adopt some insane LGBT identity with Zer pronouns and call yourself demisexual, asexual, pansexual, or some other made-up nonsense, while picking from an assortment of fake flags to represent your newly discovered sexual fetish that is an abject rejection of normal society. Say something like puppy play. And just like that, you're now an oppressed minority. And so stuff like this is being taught to kids in schools, and in a lot of cases, it's being hidden from parents, where teachers will actively encourage children not to tell their parents. They will try to make things look normal when their child is at home, yet when they come to school, be allowed to present their authentic selves, which, of course, is one that has been groomed into the kids by the very teachers themselves.
The goal of the transition closet is for our students to be able to wear the clothes that their parents approve of, come to school, and then swap out into the clothes that fit who they truly are. And I use the idea that this is like Superman changing in a phone booth. But that idea actually goes a lot further than that, because Superman isn't Clark Kent. Clark Kent is actually the disguise. And when Clark Kent goes into the phone booth, he transforms into Superman, who's really just who he truly is, Kal-El. And so this gives our trans students the opportunity to be the superheroes that we know they are.
And through all of this, regardless of what identity is chosen to escape the bad ones, the identity must have political activism included along with it. Activism must be a part of it, or it's not good enough. So they need to turn kids into what you see in my main picture here, or like this, or like this. Kids must be made into change agents, which just means being an activist. And that's exactly what kids are being taught. Just watch this right here if you don't think I'm serious.
Classroom tour part 2. Yay! Actually changed some things up since the last tour, so this will be great. So I changed our social justice wall to this because we're trying out something new in my classroom, and this just makes everything a little bit more visible. They currently have their articles for the week, but these were the articles for the week. Books we're focusing on. Our current schedule. No one's updated the shows to watch or music. Social justice word walls over here now.
So look at this right here. It's all the woke buzzwords: diversity, privilege, and so forth. And what's that in the top right corner? Oh, that's right. It's activism. Why is an elementary school teacher promoting activism to little kids? Well, for one, you can just look at this woman and tell she's a woke activist herself, and therefore she's going to train these kids to be good little activists themselves. Whether she's doing it deliberately or simply because that's what she's been trained to do. Perpetuate the woke ideology. And this is just one video of many, many others to turn kids in schools into woke activists for the Marxists. So they'll eventually do what the Red Guard in China did, to go out and destroy the old culture around them, be it statues, art, or even books.
And if the beat live, you know Lil Ju made it. Hands on my knees, shaking ass on my thigh shit. Post me a pic, finna make me a profit. When the liquor hit, then the bitch get toxic. Why the fuck you in the club when niggas wild? I've been lit since brunch, that shit. Order 42 for the table, let's pop shit. Missionary or doggy style on my top shit. Pussy ass niggas hating on me from the closet. Hoes trying to call me a snake, shit, I guess I can relate. Cause the bitch spit a whole lot of venom. And since these hoes all rats, when they come around me, all I see is a whole lot of dinner. I walk around the house butt naked and I stop at air mirror just stare at my own posterior. I don't give a fuck who talk behind my back. The bitch knew better than to let me hear. Hands on my knees, shaking ass on my thigh shape. Hands on my knees, shaking ass on my thigh shape. Hands on my knees, shaking ass on my thigh shape. Hands on my knees, hands on my knees, hands on my knees, shaking ass on my thigh shape. Hands on my knees, shaking ass on my thigh shape. Hands on my knees, shaking ass on my thigh shape. Hands on my knees, hands on my knees. Hoes said they wish a bitch would, and I'm a genie. Bitch so hot, gotta stay in bikini.
And while the kids themselves destroy these things to change the culture around them, the turning of these kids into woke activists that reject everything from the society their parents grew up in is also a means to separate them from their parents and that society, separating one generation from another, severing the cultural traditions that get passed down from parent to child. This is the means by which the Marxists have found to destroy the family, which they view as the main perpetuator of the cultural traditions that keep people from becoming revolutionary. In the case of wokeism, and more specifically critical race theory, they see the family as the main perpetuator of the white supremacist structure that is oppressing everyone.
Finally, that whites learn to be white. That suggestion by Thandika is that whites are not born white. They have to become white. And her suggestion is that white children who were not white originally, they were born human. Little by little, they have to be abused into becoming white humans. And this abuse is sometimes physical, right? Of being physically disciplined into whiteness, such as being bullied into whiteness. That's a phrase I like to use, whiteness as bully. But also it's psychological and cultural. And it becomes with caretakers and guardians, not the least of which, the more important caretakers and guardians are, of course, the white family, parents, etc. But it extends to the white nationhood as a caretaker, the white social system, the white social welfare, the white governance system. They also discipline and abuse white humans into whiteness. That is a very provocative statement. I would totally recommend reading that book.
So, if kids are made white by the family, they have to be unmade white in order to become activist revolutionaries that will overthrow the system. They have to become an ally, or anything else that will destabilize them, which actually is what queer theory is meant to do, to destabilize people. The woke definition of queer is an identity without an essence. They want kids to be confused, agitated, and resentful. So they become groomable. Then they eventually go back to their parents with this insane woke nonsense, start telling their parents about it, how they're now non-binary or pansexual, that their pronouns are now they, them, about how the United States is an oppressive white supremacist nation along with all the other diatribes. And of course, when their parents reject all of it, the child will say how their parents don't understand them, how their parents' beliefs in, say, the Constitution or the Bible or just reality itself are all outdated and oppressive, leading to the separation, which looks something like this. With that, you've now effectively separated one generation from another. You've cut off ties to the old culture and are now able to build a new one. In this case, one founded on woke Marxist ideas. And this is the plan. The woke activist teachers aren't shy about it. They'll just straight up say they want to raise a racial consciousness in children in order for these kids to see these racially oppressive systems. And when it comes to the white kids, they'll straight up say they want to induce white guilt in order for them to be out of it and full-on activists when they grow up.
I also think that, and there's some studies that have borne this out a little bit, that we don't actually, we have to support our classrooms and our student bodies in navigating racial tension if that starts to show up because white kids are feeling like, oh, I'm only always the bad guy. Like we have to, which is why we need those anti-racist models and to just have that conversation. But in terms of their development, this is going to sound really counterintuitive, especially if you're a parent. We actually, there's a number of studies that suggest we shouldn't be worrying too much about making white kids feel bad because they get so much false messages about their goodness that it's actually kind of critically important for them. Now, we don't want to induce shame, right? Which is why they need those models. They need to hear, say, yeah, white people can do racial justice too, right? Here's some examples. So we don't want to introduce shame, and there's a tricky line, and we don't want to cause racial tension where then they have no way to enter the diversity conversation. And so we need to talk about anti-racism with them. We need to give them those models. But we also actually need to, it's good for them to feel a bit, like white guilt is a really big problem. And my goal as a parent is to get my kids into white guilt and beyond it as young as possible. Because white adults are running around with white guilt and we're stuck. White guilt has to happen. It's a developmental need. If you believe in equity and you live in this kind of system and you're white, you're going to hit white guilt. So in my mind, I'm like, I need my 4-year-old to experience white guilt so I can support her out of it and beyond it. And I don't want her doing it when she's 20. I want her to be well past that point.
So this is what they want to do to kids. So by the time they grow up, they sound and act something like this. This is the woke guard. The woke left is building it out of our own children, using activist teachers and administrators in our very schools. And they're unapologetic about it. They're going to do it whether we like it or not, even if things like critical race theory are banned. These woke activists say they'll teach it anyways. These people have to be removed from these positions and never allowed around children again, because whoever has control of the children controls the next generation, and the Marxists are doing everything in their power to make sure it's them. Hey, thanks for watching. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe. You can find me on most social media sites talking about culture and politics. So do look me up and say hello. And take care, and God bless.